Hello friends, how are you? Shall we start our class today? So let's go. Sean had always been the kind of man people whispered about but never approached. Living in a small town where everyone knew each other's business, he managed to keep his life under lock and key, both figuratively and literally. The lock in question? A sturdy steel diary kept in the top drawer of his nightstand, visible yet untouchable. For years, speculations swirled about his reclusive nature. Some believed he was hiding from a criminal past, others thought he was grieving a lost love, while a few dismissed him as merely eccentric. Whatever the truth might be, no one dared to ask him directly. The house he called home was as enigmatic as he was. An old, weathered structure with ivy creeping up the stone walls, standing at the edge of the town like an ancient sentinel. It was where he retreated every evening, locking himself away from prying eyes. His routine was predictable to the point of monotony. Every morning, he would sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, nodding politely to passers-by without uttering a word. Then he'd disappear for the rest of the day, only emerging to tend to the wild garden that surrounded his house. On a chilly autumn morning, something shifted in his demeanor. Sean appeared restless, his gaze lingering on the road ahead as if expecting someone or something. He clutched the diary tighter than usual, his knuckles pale against the leather-bound cover. That day, for the first time, he ventured beyond his usual route, wandering into the heart of the town with a determined stride. His presence didn't go unnoticed. Heads turned and whispers followed as he entered a small bookstore, stayed inside briefly, and emerged clutching an envelope. Those who saw him couldn't help but wonder what had changed. As Sean walked back to his home, a sense of finality seemed to envelop him. He paused at the edge of the garden and looked over his shoulder, scanning the town as if committing it to memory. Whatever secret he held, it was clear that time was running out, and soon it would demand to be revealed. Sean's life, already a quiet mystery, took a darker turn when he returned home that evening. A faint tremor shook his hands as he locked the door behind him. His reflection in the hallway mirror showed a pale, weary face, one that had aged more in recent weeks than in the last few years. He placed the envelope he'd taken from the bookstore on the small desk in his living room, staring at it as though it held the weight of the world. Inside the envelope was a letter written in firm but elegant handwriting. The words on the page confirmed his worst fears. The illness he'd ignored for so long had progressed too far. There was no cure, and the time he had left was far shorter than he had imagined. Sean sank into his worn armchair, the letter trembling in his hands. The house seemed unbearably silent, amplifying the thunderous beat of his heart. That night, Sean didn't sleep. Instead, he paced the floor of his study, the locked diary in one hand and a pen in the other. His mind raced as he considered what to record, what truths to leave behind. There was so much he had kept buried, so much he had carried alone for decades. Now, with the shadow of death looming closer, he was uncertain if he could let the secret die with him. The next morning, Sean began his strange new routine. He wrote letters and carefully addressed each one, his hands steadier now that he had a purpose. Some letters were slipped into mailboxes under the cover of dawn. Others were handed discreetly to their intended recipients. The townspeople were puzzled but didn't question him directly. After all, Sean wasn't someone you questioned. His walks into town became more frequent, and each time he returned, the diary grew thicker with its contents. On one particularly foggy evening, Sean visited the cemetery and lingered at an unmarked grave for nearly an hour. He knelt on the ground, whispering words to someone who was no longer there. When he finally rose, there was a new resolve in his expression. It was as though he had made peace with something or someone. By the end of the week, Sean's once predictable life had become anything but. Though he remained as guarded as ever, it was clear to anyone who saw him that he was racing against an unseen clock. Whatever secret he held, it was tied not only to his past but also to the letters he was leaving behind, each one a small piece of a puzzle no one yet knew existed. Sean sat in his study with the diary open before him. The room was dimly lit, the single lamp casting shadows that danced along the walls as he turned each page. He wasn't writing this time. Instead, he was reading, revisiting entries that he hadn't dared to look at for years. Each word was a reflection of the life he had lived, a life that, in many ways, felt like someone else's. As he scanned the pages, memories began to surface, unbidden yet vivid. Sean had been young once, full of optimism and ambition. He'd arrived in the town decades earlier, a stranger with no roots but with a love that anchored him, Clara. She had been everything to him, a bright presence that seemed to light up the entire world. The two had dreamed of building a life together, and for a while it seemed possible. But tragedy struck when Clara's parents passed away in a car accident, leaving her distraught and distant. She leaned on Sean at first, but as time went on, her grief pulled her deeper into isolation. Sean tried everything to pull her back, but her pain seemed insurmountable. Then came the fateful day when she disappeared without explanation or goodbye. The town searched for her, rumors flying about her fate, yet no trace of her was ever found. The memory was sharp and painful, like a blade against Sean's heart. He had blamed himself for Clara's departure, wondering if he had failed her in her time of need. The town had moved on, but Sean hadn't. His life became defined by that singular loss, and every day since had been a reflection of his inability to let go. The diary was the only place where he allowed himself to be truly vulnerable, to express the sorrow he hid from the world. As the hours passed, Sean found himself overcome by a mix of emotions, grief, regret, and guilt. The entries in the diary grew increasingly cryptic, suggesting that there was more to Clara's disappearance than anyone knew. Sean hadn't written everything, not yet. There were secrets buried in those pages that he hadn't dared to put into words. But now, as his time dwindled, he felt the weight of those secrets pressing down on him. They begged to be freed, to be understood, even if only by himself. When dawn broke, Sean closed the diary and stared out the window. The town was waking, oblivious to the storm that raged within him. Somewhere out there, amid the routine lives of the townsfolk, were pieces of Clara's story, scattered like puzzle pieces waiting to be assembled. Sean knew he couldn't face them alone. His actions had set things in motion, and soon others would begin to uncover the truth he had spent a lifetime concealing. In the heart of the bustling newsroom, the town's young and ambitious journalist, Marcos, pored over his notes with growing fascination. The mystery surrounding Sean had always been a simmering topic, but lately it had boiled over into an obsession for him. Something about Sean's recent behavior, the letters, the frequent visits into town, the haunted expression he carried, felt like the beginning of a story that begged to be unraveled. Marcos had heard the rumors like everyone else, but he wasn't content with idle gossip. He wanted facts, something tangible that would peel back the layers of Sean's guarded existence. It started with casual observations, the bookstore visits, the unusual interest in old records, and the whispered exchanges with strangers. Then came the cemetery visit, and that was when Marcos knew there was more to uncover. What kind of man, after decades of isolation, suddenly felt compelled to connect with places and people in such peculiar ways? One evening, Marcos followed Sean at a distance, careful not to be noticed. His footsteps were silent as he trailed him to an antique shop near the edge of town. Through the shop's dusty window, Marcos watched as Sean handed over a sealed envelope to the shopkeeper, who looked both surprised and perplexed. Moments later, Sean left without a word, his expression unreadable. Marcos jotted down every detail in his notebook, the pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together. Later that night, back in his small apartment, Marcos combed through old town archives. His research led him to a name that appeared repeatedly in connection with Sean, Clara. It was a name that stirred faint recollections among the townsfolk but yielded little concrete information. However, one record caught his attention, a property deed for a secluded place referred to as the House in the Grove. The House in the Grove was long abandoned, shrouded in local legends that ranged from hauntings to forbidden love. As Marcos stared at the document, an idea began to take shape. If Sean's secret had roots in the past, then this house might hold the answers he sought. Resolving to uncover the truth, Marcos prepared for a journey into Sean's shadowed history, not knowing how deeply it would alter his own life. The house in the grove stood like a forgotten monument to another time, its cracked facade hidden beneath a canopy of overgrown trees. Marcos stood at the edge of the property, flashlight in hand, feeling a mix of trepidation and anticipation. The cool night air carried the scent of damp earth and rotting wood, and the silence was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. This was the place Sean's name had been tied to again and again, and Marcos was certain it held the answers he sought. As he approached the house, his footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path, the moonlight revealed its derelict state. The windows were boarded up, and the front door hung slightly ajar, creaking as the wind pushed against it. Marcos hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, his flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. The air was musty, and the interior was stripped bare, save for remnants of old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. Despite its emptiness, the house exuded an eerie presence, as if it were guarding secrets of its own. Marcos began his search methodically, his flashlight sweeping across the walls and floor for anything unusual. He noticed faint markings on the wooden planks, as though someone had dragged something heavy across them. Following the marks, he reached a trapdoor concealed beneath a tattered rug in the corner of the main room. His pulse quickened as he lifted the creaking panel to reveal a set of stone stairs descending into darkness. The basement was cold and damp, the walls lined with crumbling bricks. At the center of the room stood a small, rusted vault, its iron surface etched with deep grooves and faint scratches. Marcos approached it cautiously, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. The vault bore no lock, but instead required a combination to open, a set of numbers that Marcos hadn't yet uncovered. As he examined the vault, a folded piece of paper tucked into a crevice caught his eye. It was yellowed with age and bore Sean's handwriting, a cryptic note with a sequence of numbers and a phrase scrawled beneath it: "The answers lie where the light never fades." Marcos's mind raced, deciphering the riddle while his hands entered the numbers into the vault's mechanism. With a resounding click, the door swung open. Inside, he found a stack of papers bound with twine, old photographs, and a small velvet pouch. The photographs were faded, but one in particular caught Marcos's attention. Sean and Clara standing together in front of the house in the grove, their expressions tinged with both joy and sorrow. The papers revealed fragments of a narrative, details of Sean's past and Clara's disappearance, but they raised as many questions as they answered. Marcos reached for the velvet pouch, his heart pounding. He loosened the drawstring and tipped the contents into his hand, a delicate gold necklace with a locket. He opened the locket carefully, revealing a tiny photograph of Clara and an inscription, "Always here." Marcos stared at it, sensing that this discovery was only the beginning of a much larger story. Marcos sat in his apartment, the contents of the vault spread out across the coffee table. The photographs, papers, and locket seemed like fragments of a larger story, but they didn't form a complete picture. He stared at Sean's handwriting, each word a deliberate choice, as though the man had intended to reveal just enough to draw someone deeper into his mystery. The note that accompanied the photographs hinted at a connection between Sean and Clara, yet the details were maddeningly sparse. What had truly happened to her? Among the papers was Sean's diary entry, carefully preserved but partially damaged. Marcos read the words slowly, absorbing each detail. Sean had written about Clara's growing sadness, the distance that had formed between them after her parents' death, and her eventual disappearance. But there was one line that stood out, a cryptic statement: "There are truths even the heart struggles to bear." It was a clue, but what it pointed to was still unclear. Marcos found himself drawn back to the locket. He held it in his hand, feeling the weight of the metal and the significance it carried. The photograph inside showed Clara smiling, her eyes shining with an emotion that seemed to be both love and sorrow. The inscription, "Always here," nagged at him, as though it held more meaning than was immediately apparent. Determined to piece the puzzle together, Marcos revisited the archives. He searched for more records related to Clara and the house in the grove, but what he found only deepened the mystery. A newspaper clipping from decades earlier described a fire at the house, a fire that had reportedly killed an unidentified woman. The date coincided with the time of Clara's disappearance, but there was no definitive proof that the victim had been her. Marcos felt a chill run down his spine. Was this why Sean had guarded the truth so carefully? Had the fire been an accident or something else entirely? As Marcos pieced together the timeline, he began to sense a pattern in Sean's actions. The letters, the vault, the photographs, it was all leading somewhere. But just as he felt he was on the verge of a breakthrough, the realization struck him. Sean hadn't revealed everything. There were pieces missing, crucial pieces that Sean had deliberately withheld. For now, Marcos could only follow the breadcrumbs Sean had left behind. He couldn't shake the feeling that the truth, once uncovered, would change everything, not just for himself but for everyone in the town. Marcos stood in the archives room, his heart pounding as he held the photograph from the vault in one hand and the newspaper clipping in the other. The pieces of Sean's life were beginning to form a mosaic, but one vital corner remained shrouded in darkness. The phrase Sean had written, "The answers lie where the light never fades," played on repeat in Marcos's mind. It felt like the key to the puzzle, yet its meaning eluded him. He returned to the house in the grove that evening, determined to find the missing link. The wind howled as he stepped inside, his flashlight casting long shadows that seemed to ripple like waves. Marcos retraced his steps through the house, revisiting the basement and examining the vault for anything he might have missed. But no new clues emerged, leaving him frustrated and restless. It was then that he noticed the faint outline of a door in the far wall of the basement. The door was almost imperceptible, hidden behind peeling wallpaper that curled away like pages of an ancient book. Marcos carefully peeled back the remaining paper, revealing a small wooden panel. He pried it open with his pocket knife, uncovering a narrow passageway lined with old stone bricks. The air within was colder, heavier, as though the walls themselves carried the weight of centuries. The passage led him to a secluded chamber, its center illuminated by a solitary beam of moonlight that filtered through a crack in the ceiling. There, resting on a pedestal, was another sealed envelope with Sean's handwriting. Marcos opened it cautiously, revealing a single photograph of Clara, now older but unmistakably her. She stood in a garden, her face serene, with a child by her side. Behind them was a familiar house, the very house Sean lived in. The inscription beneath the photograph read, "The light is eternal." Marcos gasped. the meaning of Sean's words finally coming into focus. Clara hadn't disappeared, she had lived on, hidden in plain sight. The fire, the rumors, the secrecy, all had been part of an elaborate plan to erase her past and create a new life. But why? And what role had Sean played in her reinvention? Marcos turned the photograph over, finding another note. This one was less cryptic, more heartfelt. If you're here, you're ready to know the truth. The final piece awaits at home. Marcos's pulse quickened as he realized his next destination. Sean's house, the place he had passed every day, unassuming yet steeped in mystery, was the stage for the story's last act. Marcos arrived at Sean's house in the early hours of the morning, the first light of dawn spilling over the horizon. The once familiar structure now seemed heavy with the weight of its hidden truths. The key, it seemed, had been in front of him all along. Marcos hesitated for a moment, hand resting on the doorknob, before finally stepping inside. The air was still, and the house carried the faint scent of aged wood and solitude. He made his way to the study, where Sean's diary rested on the desk, its leather-bound cover worn and slightly cracked. Marcos flipped through the pages, now knowing they were written by a man who had lived a double life. But his eyes stopped on an entry near the end, one that hadn't been there when he first looked. The handwriting was hurried but unmistakably Sean's. It read, "To truly understand, you must find the mirror of truth." Marcos scanned the room, his flashlight catching on the large, ornate mirror that hung on the wall behind the desk. The mirror had always seemed like a decorative piece, but now it felt charged with significance. He moved closer, running his fingers along its frame until he noticed the small latch cleverly concealed at its base. With a click, the mirror swung open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a neatly folded suit, a faded photograph of a young man resembling Sean, and a stack of letters addressed to Clara. But most shocking was a single sheet of paper with Sean's full name and identification, a name that was not Sean at all. The document revealed a completely different identity, one that had been forged long before he came to the town. Marcos's breath caught as the realization dawned on him. Sean wasn't Sean. He was Clara. The fire had been no accident. It had been Clara's escape. Disfigured in the aftermath, she had chosen to reinvent herself as a man, leaving behind the pain and expectations of her past life. In a society that wouldn't have understood, she had decided to live in isolation, creating an entirely new identity to protect herself. The letters, the photographs, the riddles, they had all been breadcrumbs for someone to eventually uncover her truth, someone who would carry her story forward. Marcos sat down, the weight of the revelation pressing on him. He reread the notes, trying to piece together what Clara, Sean, had hoped to achieve. It wasn't just about revealing her identity. It was about absolution, about leaving behind the truth so that it wouldn't be lost to time. In her final letter, Clara wrote, "I lived my life as a secret, but secrets only last so long. I never intended to fool anyone, I only wanted to survive. If you're reading this, it means you've found the truth. Do with it what you will, but know that my story was one of love, loss, and the courage to begin again." Marcos felt tears sting his eyes. Sean, Clara, had lived a life of unimaginable pain and resilience. The house, the diary, even the locket, they were pieces of a person who had been forced to make impossible choices. For the first time, Marcos understood the enormity of what he had uncovered. As he left the house, the early morning sun bathed the town in a soft, golden light. Marcos carried Clara's truth with him, knowing that it wasn't just a story of tragedy but one of profound strength. The secret, long hidden, had finally come to light, and with it, a new understanding of the person who had been both Sean and Clara.